Hello and welcome to the Patreon channel of True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. We've come to the final episode in the Aftermath series. Just to reiterate, the Aftermath series is kind of like the phone data review going on, except obviously it's not the phone data review. It is still things that are happening 2 years ago today, but not strictly speaking dealing with the phone data review. Now, what is really interesting with today's episode, there's kind of like a unofficial phone data review, just as we did with Christina Meacham and Shanann. There's sort of one between Kessinger and Koback that also goes on where they sort of text one another almost like every single day up until the 29th of August. So that's something we could also do maybe sometime in September. But for this episode, which as I say is the fourth and final episode in the Aftermath series, which is sort of, it bridges episode 49 of the phone data review and then just the finale, which I'll do on the 31st. It basically just sort of wraps it up. And so in today's episode, we're going to be dealing with one particular text that was sent between Kevin Koback and this is quite an incredible thing that happened. I'm not going to go through the entire stream of messages. Like I said, we can maybe do that in a separate episode, maybe late in September. But basically on August the 29th, this came from the CBI, not the other way around. This came from Agent Kevin Koback asking Nichol Kessinger whether she'd read something that I had actually posted on a blog called Shakedown Title, right? And that was published on Wednesday the 29th. 2018. I will put a link in the description and also, well, put it on Patreon as well, so you can actually read that original post. Now, what happened with Shakedown Title was that was originally a online space where I covered various cases, especially the Oscar Pistorius case, Madeleine McCann, the Ramseys, and so on. And so it was like a big archive there, but it's quite a old site. And the idea was to sort of start a whole archive for the Watts case on Shakedown. And if you go to the drop-down menu on the Shakedown website, there are probably easily 50 or 60 posts. And eventually in mid-October, just because of the sheer size of the archive that was developing, I moved the coverage. It was often daily coverage, sometimes multi-day coverage of the Chris Watts case, to its own standalone blog. So Crime Rocket effectively became a sort of default archive for the Watts case, not only in terms of coverage, but also in terms of things like photos. In any event, it was still early in the coverage of the Watts case that I covered this story on Nichol Kessinger. So bear in mind that although I was trying to create this sort of definitive archive of the Chris Watts case, early on there was no way of knowing that I was going to achieve that. So it was very much a feather in my cap. I felt quite good about seeing in the discovery that the CBI had actually referenced this blog that I'd written early on, as early as the 29th of August 2018. And what that showed was that they were monitoring what was being said online, and this was something that they flagged, and they actually passed it on to Kessinger and said, Have you seen this? What do you think about this? And so if we go to their correspondence between 9:45 a.m. and 10:09 on the morning of August 29th, 2018, 2 years ago today, it was a Wednesday, Nicole Kessinger sent the Colorado Bureau of Investigation the following text. Right? She said, "Did you see the news?" Koback answered yes. And this was in reference to stuff going on about Trent Bolt. Bolt was claiming that he'd had a homosexual affair with Chris Watts, which now seems to be bogus, like a false flag. Kessinger says, do you think that's a real claim? So she's not sold on it immediately. She says, if so, do you think you can find him? So what's quite interesting is that she directs him to that news on Trent Bolt. But it seems like they were aware of it anyway. But anyway, when she asks Koback, do you think that's a real claim? He says no idea. In other words, he doesn't confirm it. He doesn't say, I think so, or maybe. He says, I've got no idea. I don't know whether it is or not. And I must say, I felt the same way. It was also like, well, it's difficult to know for sure. Because there is an aspect about Chris Watts that feels like he could be gay, because he's kind of, I don't know, it's just, one feels that it's possible. On the other hand, it does seem a little bit unlikely. And it seems like in the fullness of time, in hindsight, feels like that wasn't a real claim. Do you agree? Chris Watts, when confronted about Trent Bolt, said, no, I've never met him and I'm not gay and all that kind of thing. And certainly in his text messages, there's nothing related to that. There's nothing, absolutely nothing from his phone that would indicate anything like that. Or even from Shanann's phone. Anyway, Kessinger says, if so, do you think you can find him? In other words, if you think it's legitimate, do you think you can find him? And Koback says yes. And we know that the FBI did actually interview Trent Bolt. And in the beginning, Coda, a lot of people have a lot of praise for Coda, that is this brilliant interrogator. Coda in the beginning didn't believe Trent Bolt, and I think he told him that. But then later on, it seems like he did believe him. And ultimately, it looks like it wasn't believable. It wasn't true. Interestingly, Koback asked Kessinger, did he ever mention anything about that? And he's now referring to being gay or whatever, bisexual. And Kessinger says, not at all. I don't know if I believe this yet, but he fooled me into thinking he was a much different person than he is, so anything is possible. I think that's quite an authentic answer from her. I think she's she's saying this is possible, but she also seems to be saying, I think it's unlikely. Bear in mind, at some point she did Google a threesome thing, for the Saturday night, threesomes and all that kind of thing. And I think even double penetration. And that you've got to sort of ask, well, does she know more than she's letting on? But basically 2 weeks after the crime, you basically have this false narrative entering the ether, and Kessinger's sort of wanting the CBI to know about it. And bear in mind, it's got to help her. If the attention is on this guy, whether or not it's legitimate, it's going to help her. And it kind of did. There was a lot of interest in Trent Bolt, and also to some extent in Amanda McMahon, and people kind of forgot about Kessinger. Some people didn't even know about Kessinger. In other cases, there was a sort of a slight rumor about her, but nothing confirmed. And so Trent Bolt kind of became the lightning rod for, speculation and gossip and all that kind of thing. And one wonders whether that was innocent or by design. Did someone put Trent Bolt up to that to distract from Kessinger, who worked at Anadarko? Or was it kind of just random? This guy who just wanted attention and maybe had kind of maybe was under an illusion that he had a relationship with Chris Watts or whatever. You know what I mean? Maybe he was just sort of not in the right place mentally when all of this happened. In other words, he was sincere but misguided, if I can put it that way. Or was it something else? Was this part of an elaborate ruse, a distraction? And I must say that's a question that for me is quite hard to answer, because when you say it was done on purpose, then you really are going into conspiracies. And you've got to sort of ask yourself, what is more likely? That there are some oddballs in the world, or that someone would literally pay these people to create like a false flag that is going to distract people?
Chris did ask me to visit him in jail. Well, I can't say asked me, but his attorneys told me that Chris said he would get me on the list and all this. His family, I have a lot of questions. Why? Why didn't he just divorce her? Why didn't he listen to me?
So that is a clip from Inside Edition, and I think it comes from around about November 2018. I can't find the clip from HLN, but they sort of covered this around about now, 2 years ago today, around about the 29th, 28th of August. Trent Bolt was sort of entering the airwaves, this alleged Formula 11. He wasn't only on HLN once, I think he was on twice. And that's another aspect that I think is quite strange about this case, is that HLN were covering this case. Crime Rocket and HLN were sort of covering it more than anybody else, sort of a daily thing. And then it sort of exploded after that. But it was basically HLN doing television analysis, on television analysis, every single day. And I remember reading on Facebook, on HLN's Facebook channel, just people saying, can you please stop covering the Chris Watts case? We've had enough of it. And other people just saying, please don't stop covering it. And I very much appreciated HLN's coverage. There were some things that they would cover that I was covering, but they would cover it from a different angle that I thought was really interesting. Some things I didn't know about, like the GPS data that they found out about. They also found out about hundreds of small hairs in the back of Chris Watts' truck. I don't know if that was an error, but they apparently were aware of that. But something that I think they got wrong was where they spoke about the thief hatch and all that kind of thing. But it was nevertheless just great having a second voice, sort of trying to figure out what was going on before we knew what was going on. So I just want to remind you that on October 16th, almost exactly a month before the plea deal, Ashley Banfield was basically jettisoned off HLN, and she sort of disappeared for a while. It caught me by surprise. I think caught a lot of people by surprise. To sort of like, why? And I don't think you could argue that HLN was losing viewers. I mean, maybe they were, but I was under the impression that it was very watchable, that there were a lot of people interested, and my efforts have certainly gained a huge audience. So I don't know what Ashley Banfield was doing wrong, unless somebody said, we need you guys to stop talking about this. Again, it's sort of conspiracy theory. I don't like talking about it, but it's sort of like, why did this happen? Also, why did it happen when it happened? And, Ashley Banfield was on HLN for quite a while, so the timing is just strange, October 16th. So I just want to provide that context, that there was a concern. What is the media going to say? What does the media think about this? What is the public's response and all that? And bear in mind how the autopsy reports were held back, how Kessinger's identity was also kept under wraps right until the end, right, really until the discovery was released. The district attorney really never even spoke about her, never mentioned her by name in the sentencing hearing. So I think there was an attempt to suppress, that might be the wrong word, just to keep a lot of the information as under the radar as they possibly could. In other words, to not fan the flame of this high-profile case, to try to make it go away, to make it blow over. But did it work? And if you think about the whole going down the wrong rabbit hole with Trent Bolt, it's also sort of like, you have the wrong person that's distracting you from Kessinger, and then the story ends up being a dead end. Well, that's also a way to sort of have your interest wane when you have stories like that. Although in a weird way, I think in the Watts case, anything about it just was like a lightning rod. In any event, at the time, on the 29th of August, Kessinger's quite on board with this. She says, I have some dates for things he said that I think are in line with some things that other men claimed. So Kessinger's not just saying, hey, did you see the news? She's actually seems to be trying to prop up his story or trying to reinforce his story, just saying, here are things that he said, and I've got some dates for things that are actually in line with that. And she says, I already had them on my list to talk to you about. And Koback answers with a single word, okay. He's not particularly, doesn't seem particularly interested in what Kessinger's got to say. What Koback is interested in is he sends Kessinger a link and he says, have you seen this? So he doesn't seem particularly interested in Trent Bolt, but what he is interested in, and this is obviously, it's not coming from Nichol Kessinger. It's coming from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and they sending a link to a blog post I wrote on Shakedown, which was published on the 23rd of August. So it was sent to Kessinger 6 days later, just less than a week later, and It was that blog post, is she Chris Watts' mystery mistress? And you can see the link in Koback's correspondence, and you can see the image that is referenced at that hyperlink, which is an old photo of Nichol Kessinger. Now, I posted that blog 2 days after Watts appeared in court for the second time, and I posted it based on information presented and later removed or redacted from the warrantless arrest affidavit. So what I remember was waiting, like almost like ready to pounce on some of the discovery that was being released at the Colorado sort of court site online. There were the motions that were coming out, whatever, and I was sort of watching those like a hawk every day. And then when the warrantless arrest affidavit came out, I quickly looked at it, and I think what happened was they actually published it perhaps in error, because there was a long list of names at the end of it. And then not long after that, it was a short time after they'd published the original, they published a abbreviated arrest affidavit. So the original text, which is about 3 pages, stayed the same, but the names after that were sort of not there anymore. But the problem is that they'd already done it, and some people like me managed to catch it, with these names afterwards. Now, it didn't necessarily mean anything when you got the original warrantless arrest affidavit. There were a lot of names, and not all of them meant something. So if you look at the page in question, there's Kevin Koback, and at the time that the warrantless arrest affidavit came out, we didn't know who he was. He turned out to be a very important figure. Kevin Hoyland, on opposite Kevin Koback, was also instrumental in the investigation, but at the time we didn't know really who he was. Graham Coder, instrumental, but we didn't know who he was. Then someone called Todd Sandsted, I still don't know who he is. And then there was Nichol, Kessinger, and Cody Roberts. Now, Nichol, Kessinger, and Cody Roberts, it was just like, okay, so they're not law enforcement, and there wasn't even an address for Nichol Kessinger. So at the time that this came out, they still didn't have an address for her, which is quite interesting. And now the question was, so who are these people? And you had the option of checking every single person, Googling their name or whatever. And that is what a good, thorough, sort of on-the-ball investigator is going to do. And since it wasn't very hard to join the dots. I mean, since the affidavit explicitly mentioned Watts was actively having an affair with a co-worker, actively meaning sort of it was going on up until the time of the crime. In other words, up to the present. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out who she was. All one had to do was go through the list of female names on the affidavit. So that was the first thing. You would look for females on the affidavit and then exclude those involved in law enforcement, right? And then cross-reference those female names that were affiliated with the oil industry. Now, you could argue and say, well, if you came across Nichol Kessinger,